The night my father told me to get out and never come back, the kitchen smelled like beef stew and fresh bread. The porch light threw a pale circle across the snow-damp steps, and the old clock over the stove kept clearing its throat at the end of every minute. He stood at the head of the oak table, hands braced on the varnished edge, a red flush rising from his collar, as if anger could climb like heat. My mother's spoon hovered over the pot, tapping once, twice, like a nervous metronome. I had just said the word Chicago, and it hung in the air the way a glass hovers between a hand and the floor too late to catch, impossible not to break. He didn't shout at first. The silence did that job. Then he pointed at the door with the same hand that used to steady my handlebars and said evenly, at first, "If you're going, then go." The last part came with a slam of palm to wood. "Get out and never come back. Before I go on, tell me where you're listening from, down in the comments. And if you've ever been told your worth begins and ends with what you give, tap that like button and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Make sure you're subscribed these stories. Find us right when we're ready for them. But to understand how that sentence froze me in place, you need to know what came before it. The years of quiet, the careful math, the way love can turn into a ledger when no one is honest. I grew up in that Boston split-level house with drafty windows in February and a maple tree out front that tried its best every October. My father Frank worked 3 decades at a manufacturing company where the air smelled like hot metal and oil. My mother Linda kept the school office running with glue sticks, permission slips, and the kind of smile that hushes a room. They were good at being steady. Paychecks came, holidays had ham and green beans, the porch light always came on when I pulled into the driveway late. They taught me to save for what I wanted and return the shopping cart even when it rained. When I turned 27, the lightning struck. Restructuring the letter said as if a life could be set back up differently with a better wrench. My father came home with a box of picture frames and paperweights. The chair at the table stayed the same, but the man inside it shrank by half an inch. That first month, my mother called me with a tremor in her voice that I had only heard once before when I had pneumonia at 8. "We might miss the mortgage," she whispered. "Just this once, I am a financial advisor. I talk to strangers about risk and retirement and how to turn a paycheck into a future. I know the numbers that keep you safe." I wired $3,000 that afternoon. The relief in my mother's exhale felt like stepping into warm light, and I told myself it was temporary. Temporary became routine, and routine became expected. I watched a neat line appear on my banking app every month, like a tide mark $3,000 pulled from my account to keep the porch light on at home. We never had the talk where you put the bills in a row and point to what's possible and what must change. I tried. My father's jaw would tighten, and he'd say, "Family helps family," as if answering a moral riddle I hadn't asked. My mother would pivot to the neighbor's new puppy or the weather. Meanwhile, the living room got a new sectional because the sale was too good, and the Florida trip for your father's health stayed on the calendar like a prescription. A new sedan joined the driveway for safety. I kept my couch from a thrift store and a coffee table that had one wobbly leg. At first, I didn't mind the trade. A daughter protects the roof that kept her dry. I still believed my father would find something close to what he had, that this rough patch was just a bad mile on a long road. But months layered into years, and the math sharpened. I kept a quiet spreadsheet, the kind of simple truth a calculator can't blush at. It climbed past 75,000, past 100, and I learned how resentment looks when it keeps its voice down. It looks like a woman in a secondhand chair staring at a down payment she can't touch because her childhood home eats it month after month. I dated a good man named Brian for a while. He was the kind who fixed leaky faucets because it bothered him to hear them drip. One night, he studied my kitchen like it was a budget. "You're burning yourself down to keep them warm," he said softly. I told him he didn't understand how family works. He didn't argue, just kissed my forehead and wished me better weather. I watched him walk away and told myself this was what patience looks like. At work, I rose without fanfare. Clients listened. The numbers lined up. My boss, Margaret, reads people the way I read spreadsheets. She sees where a person is leaning before their feet move. She asked me to meet her for coffee one Wednesday, and the cafe smelled like cinnamon and something clean. "We're opening in Chicago," she said. 40% raise. You'd build the department. Inside me, a window opened all at once. 40% is not just a number. It's breathing room. It's a repaired car without a prayer. It's a sofa purchased because you like the way your back feels when you sit on it, not because it was $50 and had good bones. I floated the idea at Sunday dinner, the one where my mother's stew made the house feel safe. "They're looking for people to transfer," I said too casually. "It would be a promotion." My mother's fork stopped with 2 peas balanced like a dare. "Chicago," she said, as if I had proposed Mars. My father didn't look up from his plate. "You make good money here," he said. "Who's going to help with the house when something breaks?" We didn't say the mortgage. It sat between us anyway, a large uninvited guest eating quietly. I said it would be months away and that I'd help plan the transition. My father's jaw tightened the same muscle twitch I used to notice when I'd push a rule. "Selfish," my mother murmured almost to herself the word, a little boat that found the current quickly. I went home and stared at my ceiling until the dark turned thin. The next day, I asked Margaret for time to think. I bought a blue blouse my mother once said made my eyes bright, a small peace offering for a battle I was still trying to avoid. When I invited them to talk through it, I came with a folder, not an ultimatum, a map. Lines and numbers. Options with edges. A 6-month taper on my help while they looked at programs, reverse mortgages, renting a room, or selling for something smaller that didn't need me to hold it up. I made a reservation at their favorite restaurant after, as if we could close the night on creme brulee and a plan the way decent families do when life changes shape. It was winter dim by the time we sat down at the table. The overhead light made a halo on the oak. My mother had set out cloth napkins like we were honoring a guest. We ate First Weather Neighbors, an old movie on TV. When the plates were pushed back, I set the folder on the wood and opened it with careful hands. "I accepted the promotion," I said. "It's 6 weeks away. I want to make this change the right way." My mother glanced at the papers and pulled her hands into her lap. My father didn't look. He kept his face on a middle distance like someone trying not to flinch at a doctor's office. I explained it all, how I could taper my help, how we could talk to a specialist together. I said the word sustainable because it's the only word that matters when the tide keeps erasing your footprints. My father pushed back his chair. The scrape was sharper than it needed to be. "So that's it," he said. "They wave a bigger check, and you forget where you came from." "That's not fair," I said, feeling heat climb my throat. "I've paid the mortgage for over 4 years. It was never supposed to be forever." "We put a roof over your head for 18, my mother said, voice trembling, the same note she used when I forgot to call in college. "Food, clothes, college help. And now that we need you now, you run?" I breathed in slow so I wouldn't say something I couldn't take back. "I am grateful. I am also 34 with no house of my own and savings that look like loose change beside what they should be. I want to help you stand without me." "We're not selling this house," my father snapped. "I built this life. I won't watch you tear it down because you think you've outgrown us." I looked at the walls, the framed class photos Mom kept from the school, a faded watercolor of the harbor we never quite got around to rematting. I looked at the sink where my father used to wash his hands twice after mowing the lawn because the smell of grass lingered. "It's not about outgrowing," I said softer. "It's about not drowning." He slammed his palm flat on the table and the salt shaker jumped. "If the mortgage is such a burden, then stop," he shouted. "We never forced you." Something inside me paused. That's the moment a listener misses if you blink the small shift when a whole world rearranges itself. You called me crying, I said quietly. Every time I tried to talk about a plan, you changed the subject or called me selfish. You didn't have to force me. You just let me. He stared past me to the window to the dark yard where the maple wore a lace of frost. When he looked back, there was a new hardness in his mouth I had never seen. You want Chicago, take Chicago. But don't expect anything from us. You choose money over family, you live with it. Get out, he said, pointing to the door, each word a nail. And never come back. My mother made a small sound, like a dish cracking, and pressed the corner of her napkin to her eye. She didn't say stop. She didn't say Frank, enough. She folded the napkin again and watched her hands. I gathered the pages I had prepared, papers that suddenly felt foolish maps for people who didn't want a road. My chair legs whispered against the tile. I tucked the folder into my bag and took the bottle of wine I'd brought off the counter because I couldn't bear to leave even that behind. I walked to the door while my father stood rigid as a man guarding a gate. On the porch, the cold reached for my throat. The light over the door hummed, casting a small circle on the wet concrete. My breath lifted in slow white threads. Behind me, the house was quiet in the way of houses after a storm. Nothing moved, but you could smell the change. I held the railing the way I used to when I was 5 and practiced going down without a hand. The maple creaked. Somewhere in the neighborhood, a dog barked twice and then thought better of it. I made it to my car before the tears came, the cheap leather under my palms turning slick. I turned the key, and the heater coughed up air that smelled like dust and old pennies. In the rearview mirror, my own face looked older, like grief had drawn its finger across it once. I set the wine on the passenger seat and laughed once, an ugly broken sound that still somehow helped. I drove until the streetlights blurred into one long ribbon. I parked outside my apartment and sat while the engine ticked itself cool. The phone on the console lit up with no new messages. For a full minute, I almost turned the car around, as if there might be a different version of the night waiting if I arrived quickly enough. Then I saw my hands steady now, no tremor, and understood what steadiness really means. Inside, I kicked off my shoes by habit and stood in the dark until my eyes adjusted. The second-hand couch looked softer than it ever had. In the next room, the cheap clock I'd bought at a discount store kept time like the one in the old kitchen patient as a heartbeat. I slid the folder from my bag and placed it on the coffee table. My chest felt hollow, like someone had taken out the heavy drawer where I kept my daughter and hadn't put it back. Still in that hollow, a thin, unfamiliar draft moved cooler than the fear, cleaner than the guilt. It could have been the air through a poorly sealed window, or it could have been the first hint of something else I hadn't allowed in for years. I turned off the porch light in my mind and sat very still, listening to the clock. Somewhere underneath the hurt under the rules I'd carried like a coat that didn't fit, a quieter truth cleared its throat and prepared to speak. The apartment was quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator. I hadn't turned on any lights. The street outside painted a faint orange line across my living room, and for a long while, I just sat there watching it creep across the floorboards. Every few seconds, the heater groaned through the walls like it was trying to comfort me, but even the warmth felt heavy that night. When morning came, it was gray and soft, the kind of Boston winter morning that makes you move slower without knowing why. My eyes were swollen from crying my throat raw. I stared at my phone on the counter, waiting for it to ring, half expecting my mother's voice to fill the silence, but it never did. By late afternoon, I called Alicia. The words tumbled out before I could think about the shouting about my father's face, about how the door closed like an ending I hadn't written. Within half an hour, she was standing at my door in her old wool coat, her hair still damp from the snow. She didn't ask for details right away. She just opened her arms, and I fell into them like someone who hadn't slept in days. "You're staying with us," she said, in the kind of voice that doesn't wait for agreement. Mark already made up the guest room. "You're not going through this alone." Her small car smelled like coffee and pine air freshener. I watched the snowflakes blur against the windshield as she drove. Boston at night looked like a movie I didn't recognize any more familiar streets, but different somehow, like I'd stepped out of my own frame. When we reached her house, Mark met us at the door holding 2 mugs of chamomile tea. He didn't say much, just patted my shoulder, but his quiet presence said what words couldn't. Their guest room had a soft quilt with tiny stitched violets and a small lamp that cast an amber glow. I sat on the edge of the bed, trying to breathe in the unfamiliar peace of it. That night, I alternated between crying and staring at the ceiling until sleep finally found me. The next morning, Alicia sat me down at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee strong enough to wake the dead. She waited until I finished half of it before she spoke. "You need to call your therapist today," she said gently. "What your dad said, it's not something you can untangle on your own." I nodded, too tired to argue. I'd been seeing Dr. Linden for 2 years, mostly about work stress, though deep down, I'd always known it was about more than work. When I called her office, the receptionist squeezed me in that afternoon. Alicia insisted on driving me like I might lose my nerve halfway there. When I walked into Dr. Linden's office, the familiar smell of vanilla and old books made my chest tighten. She greeted me with her calm smile, and when I sat down, I couldn't hold it in anymore. The words came out broken and fast, the whole story spilling into the space between us. When I finally stopped talking, she didn't speak right away. She just let the silence sit until my breathing steadied. "What your father said was extremely hurtful," she said softly. "But tell me, why did part of you feel relieved afterward?" Her question caught me off guard. Relief wasn't the word I'd used, but it was the truth I hadn't dared to say aloud. I sat there staring at my hands. "Because it's over," I whispered. The guilt, the pressure, the constant fear of disappointing them. It all stopped for a second when he said those words. It broke something, but it also freed something. She nodded slowly. "That's an important realization, Dora. You've been living in a codependent dynamic for years. Your parents dependent on your money. You dependent on their approval. Breaking that pattern is painful, but it's also the only way either of you can grow." I stared at the carpet, trying to absorb the weight of it. Codependent. It sounded clinical, but it fit like a puzzle piece I'd been missing. "What if they never talk to me again?" I asked quietly. "Then you'll have your answer," she said. "But tell me this, if your father truly meant, get out and never come back, what would it mean to keep paying their mortgage?" I blinked at her. I hadn't thought of that, not once. "You'd be honoring his rejection," she continued, "while still giving him the benefits of your sacrifice. Think about whether that's the kind of respect you owe yourself." That night back at Alicia's, I couldn't stop turning the idea over in my mind. If he meant what he said, then maybe it was time to take him at his word completely. Over the next few days, the thought grew stronger. Alicia and Mark cooked dinners that filled the house with warmth, baked chicken mashed potatoes, the kind of food that reminds you what normal feels like. We talked about work, about my upcoming move to Chicago, but under it all, the question kept pulsing. By the end of the week, I had my answer. I spent Saturday morning at my bank. The teller looked up at me when I asked to stop the automatic transfers. "You're sure?" she asked. "I'm sure," I said, though my voice trembled a little. It felt strange signing the papers. For 4 years, I'd watched that same amount disappear every month without hesitation. Now it was like reclaiming a part of myself I didn't know I'd lost. From there, I went to a small cafe near the harbor and opened my laptop. The cursor blinked on a blank email for several minutes before I started typing. I wrote and deleted paragraphs until the words settled into something simple, almost businesslike. Dear Mom and Dad, I'm respecting Dad's request that I get out and never come back. I will no longer be paying the mortgage or providing financial support. I'm moving to Chicago as planned. If you ever want to rebuild our relationship on healthier terms, my door remains open. Love, Dora. I read it 3 times, then hit send before I could lose courage. Afterward, I turned off my phone. I didn't want to see whatever might come next. The following week passed in a blur of logistics, arranging movers, finalizing work details, and sorting through the modest furniture I owned. Without the constant drain of their mortgage, I noticed something new. My budget finally balanced. I could breathe. Each night, Alicia would poke her head into the guest room just to check on me. Sometimes we talked until midnight about everything and nothing, the kind of easy companionship that doesn't demand anything in return. Still, the silence from my parents was deafening. No calls, no texts, not even an email. I checked my inbox more times than I care to admit, expecting anger or guilt or something. But there was nothing. The quiet was both a wound and a balm. When the day of my move finally came, Boston was waking from winter. The trees were still bare, but the light had softened. Alicia and Mark drove me to the airport. We hugged for a long time at the gate. "You'll be okay," she said. "Better than okay." The flight to Chicago was smooth. From the window, the lake looked like brushed steel under the morning sun. My company had arranged a temporary apartment downtown, floor-to-ceiling windows, white walls, and a view that stretched so far it made my chest ache. For the first time in years, my money was my own. I bought groceries without calculating what I'd have left after the mortgage. I ordered new towels, a set of dishes that matched, and a small plant for the kitchen windowsill. Ordinary things, but they felt extraordinary to me. Work kept me busy. The new office buzzed with energy, and the team looked to me for direction. Every morning, I walked in with a quiet confidence I hadn't felt in years. Margaret noticed it too. "You seem lighter," she said during a meeting. "Whatever you're doing, keep doing it." Still at night, when the city lights blinked across the glass, I couldn't help but wonder how my parents were managing. 2 weeks after the move, the first voicemail arrived. "Dora, it's Mom. The mortgage payment didn't go through. Please call me back." The next day came another. "Sweetheart, the bank sent a notice. There'll be penalties. We need to talk." I didn't respond. I wasn't ready. By the 3rd week, the tone began to change. "Honey, we haven't heard from you. Are you okay? Please, just let us know you're safe." That one made my eyes sting. Then came the last one, shaky and desperate. "Dora, please. The bank is threatening foreclosure. Your father didn't mean what he said. We need you." I listened twice, then called Dr. Linden the next morning. During our session, I played the messages for her. She listened quietly, her expression thoughtful. "How do they make you feel?" she asked when they ended. "Confused," I admitted, "angry, guilty, sad that it took a crisis for them to reach out." "All of those feelings are valid," she said. "But this is your moment to decide what boundaries you want to set. You can care without collapsing." That night, I sat by the window with a glass of wine, the city glowing beneath me. The phone lay on the table beside me, and for the first time, I wasn't afraid of it. I knew what I had to do, but I also knew I could wait until I was ready. Outside, a light rain began to fall, soft and rhythmic against the glass. I watched it trace paths down the window, thinking about the house I'd grown up in, the creak of its floors, the way the porch light flickered on winter nights. I still loved it, but from a distance now, the way you love an old photograph. I would call my mother soon, but not tonight. Tonight, I would sit in this new life, surrounded by air that was finally mine to breathe. Somewhere between guilt and peace, I felt the faint stir of something stronger taking root. It wasn't happiness yet, just the beginning of self-respect, steady and quiet, like dawn behind closed blinds. The rain carried on through the night, gentle and steady, washing the city in a sound that made it easier to think. I sat by the window, the glass cool beneath my palm, the skyline blurred by fog. The phone rested beside me, quiet now, its screen still from hours of indecision. I hadn't called my mother back yet, but her last message lingered, like a weight I couldn't set down. By morning, I knew I couldn't avoid it any longer. The sun broke through the clouds for the first time in days, spilling soft light across the hardwood floor. I poured myself a cup of coffee, took a slow breath, and finally pressed her number. She answered on the first ring, her voice trembling with relief. "Dora." "Oh, thank God. Are you all right?" "I'm fine," I said, keeping my tone calm. "I got your messages." There was a long pause before she spoke again. "The bank sent another notice. They said the payment's overdue. Did something happen with your account?" I stared at the window, tracing the condensation with my thumb. "No, Mom. I canceled the automatic payment." "What do you mean, canceled?" Her voice sharpened with confusion. "I stopped paying the mortgage," I said quietly. "Dad told me to get out and never come back. I'm just respecting his wishes." Another pause. I could hear her breathing, uneven and quick. "Dora, that was different. He didn't mean it. He seemed very clear," I said. "And you didn't disagree." She sighed heavily, as if my reason had become another burden. "The mortgage has nothing to do with that night. That was family tension. This is about responsibility." The words struck me not because they were cruel, but because they were so familiar. That same tone had kept me tethered for years. "Mom," I said softly, "for 4 years, I've been paying your mortgage $3,000 a month while trying to build a future of my own. You never once asked how that affected me. You just assumed I'd keep doing it." Her voice broke. "We needed you. You know that. We can't make the payments on our own." "I do know that," I said. "And that's why I tried to help you plan before I moved. But when I brought up change, Dad threw me out of the house." That wasn't a misunderstanding. That was a choice. I could hear the faint rustle of tissues, the kind of sound that once made me fold instantly, but not this time. "You can't just walk away," she said. "We'll lose everything." "There are other options," I replied. "You can downsize or apply for senior assistance programs. You could rent out a room or talk to a financial counselor." She let out a bitter laugh. "Your father will never agree to sell." "Then he needs to find another way," I said gently. "Because I can't keep doing this, Mom. Not when it's costing me everything." There was a long silence before she whispered, "You've changed. You sound so cold." I swallowed hard. "No, I'm just learning what healthy love sounds like." I didn't hang up right away. Neither of us spoke for nearly a minute. Then she said softly, "I'll talk to your father," and the line went dead. The quiet afterward was heavy, but also clarifying. I sat there for a while, listening to the clock in the kitchen tick its small, steady rhythm. For the first time in years, the weight of their expectations wasn't pressing on my shoulders. It felt strange, lonely, but freeing. That evening, the phone rang again. My father's name appeared on the screen. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something in me wanted to face it. I answered. "How dare you cut off the mortgage," he said without greeting. "After everything we've done for you." "Hello to you too, Dad," I said, keeping my voice even. I sent you an email explaining everything. I didn't mean what I said that night, he snapped. That was about you leaving, not about money. Then you should have said that sooner, I replied. You told me to get out and never come back. I took you at your word. This is ridiculous, he said. You know we can't afford those payments. You're punishing us. No, Dad. This isn't punishment, it's consequence. You can't tell me I'm no longer part of the family, then still expect my money to show up every month. There was silence on the line. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower, almost tired. What do you want, Dora? I want respect, I said, and honesty. I want you to recognize that I've carried this burden alone for years while you refuse to make changes. I want an apology for what you said. And I want to rebuild a relationship that isn't based on money. He exhaled a sound more like a sigh than anger. And if we can't agree to all that, then you'll have to handle the house without me, I said quietly. The same way you did before I stepped in. I heard the faint clink of a coffee mug, a shuffle of feet. Then he muttered, I need to think about this. That's fair, I said. Take your time. When the call ended, I stood in the middle of my apartment, heart pounding, but strangely light. The conversation hadn't fixed anything, but it had drawn a line I should have drawn years ago. Days passed, each one steadier than the last. My new life began to take shape. I walked to work through streets that smelled of coffee and morning rain, past small parks where people walked their dogs before dawn. The air was different here, cool, clean, almost forgiving. At the office, I poured my focus into building the new department. My colleagues respected me. My boss trusted me. And for once, I wasn't living under a cloud of guilt. The salary increase felt like more than money. It was validation proof that I had built something solid on my own. Yet every evening, as the city lights blinked across the water, I thought of my parents. I wondered if they'd found a way forward, or if the house still echoed with silence. One gray Saturday morning, my phone rang again. The doorman's voice was apologetic. Ms. Thompson, there's a couple here saying they're your parents. Should I send them up? The world seemed to tilt for a moment. Tell them I'll meet them in the lobby in 10 minutes. I said, my voice steady, though my hands trembled. I changed into jeans and a sweater, tied my hair back, and took a long breath before stepping into the elevator. The lobby smelled faintly of rain and polished wood. They were waiting near the window, my mother clutching her purse, my father standing stiff beside her. Dora, she said, her voice small. You look good. Thank you, I replied. This is unexpected. We needed to see you, my father said, his tone restrained but direct. We're out of time with the bank. I nodded toward the cafe across the street. Let's talk somewhere else. The rain had started again, fine and silver against the pavement. Inside the cafe, the air was warm with the smell of roasted beans and vanilla syrup. We sat in a corner booth, the kind that made every conversation feel private. For a while, no one spoke. My mother stirred her coffee without drinking it. My father rubbed the back of his neck, a gesture I remembered from every difficult talk we'd ever had. We're going to lose the house, he said finally. 30 days. That's all they gave us. I'm sorry, I said quietly. Have you considered the options I mentioned before? We can't downsize. My mother said quickly. The market's terrible. We'd never get enough to buy something smaller. There are rentals, I said. You don't have to own to have a home. She shook her head. It's not the same. My father leaned forward, his voice softer now. I've been looking for work. At my age, nobody wants to hire you full-time. That's not true, I said. There are companies that value experience. You just have to keep trying. He looked down at his hands. I don't want to talk about that. I folded my fingers around my coffee cup. I'm not resuming the payments, Dad. That part isn't changing. Then why did you agree to see us? My mother asked, eyes shining. If you're not going to help, what's the point? I am helping, I said gently. Just not the way I used to. I can help you build a plan, look at budgets, find resources, but I won't write the checks anymore. My father sighed, shoulders slumping. I said some harsh things that night. I was angry, scared. I know I said. But it wasn't just that night, Dad. It was years of pretending everything was fine while I carried the weight for all of us. I reached into my bag and slid a folder across the table. Inside was a spreadsheet, 4 years of mortgage payments, every transfer, every dollar accounted for. At the bottom, the total glowed in neat black ink, $175,000. He stared at the number for a long time. My mother covered her mouth with her hand. We never realized it was so much, she whispered. That's part of the problem, I said. It became normal, expected. You never saw what it cost me. My father's face softened, the fight draining from him. We never meant to take advantage of you. I know you didn't mean to, I said, but that's what happened. I spent my 30s keeping a house that wasn't mine while putting my own life on hold. He nodded slowly. So, what do we do now? You make hard choices, I said gently. Sell rent, find new income, whatever it takes. But you do it together without leaning on me. He sat back, the lines around his eyes deepening. When did you get so wise, when I realized no one else was coming to save me? I said. He smiled faintly, almost proud. We've been unfair to you, he said. I see that now. My mother reached across the table and touched my hand. We miss you, Dora. I miss you too, I admitted. But things can't go back to the way they were. If we rebuild, it has to be different. My father nodded slowly. Then we'll make it better. The words weren't a promise, not yet, but they were something new, something closer to truth. When we stepped back into the rain, it had lightened to a mist. We stood there for a moment, the three of us not hugging, not saying much, just breathing the same air again. For the first time in years, it didn't feel like a transaction. It felt like a beginning. As they walked toward their car, I watched them go, a quiet ache, settling somewhere deep, but no longer sharp. The city lights reflected on the wet pavement, and I stood under the awning until they disappeared around the corner. I didn't know what would come next, but I knew the balance had shifted. For the first time, we were all standing on equal ground. The following weeks moved quietly, like the soft hum of a train that's finally found its track. My parents returned to Boston, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel weighed down by the thought of them. The conversation in the coffee shop had settled something deep between us. It wasn't resolution yet, but it was the truth, laid bare, something our family had avoided for far too long. I threw myself into work leading my new team through the quarter's projects. Chicago was coming alive again. Spring sunlight spilled across the lakefront, and the air carried that fresh, forgiving scent that only arrives after a long winter. I spent weekends exploring, wandering through bookstores and quiet cafes where no one knew my story. For the first time, life felt like it belonged entirely to me. Then one evening, in late May, I came home to a manila envelope waiting at my door. It was postmarked from Boston, the handwriting unmistakably my mother's. Inside was a short letter, written in her careful looping script. Your father and I have been thinking about everything you said it began. You were right. It can't go back to the way it was. We've started looking into selling the house. I sat down on the couch and read it again, slower this time. The letter went on to describe how they'd met with a realtor and toured smaller homes in a nearby town. My father had even applied for a full-time managerial position at a larger hardware chain. My mother had taken extra bookkeeping clients from her school contacts. It ended with a line that made my chest tighten. We're trying, Dora, and we're proud of you. Love, Mom. I folded the letter and held it for a long while. Outside, the city was quiet, except for the faint hum of traffic. I didn't cry, but something inside me softened the way frost gives way under the first real warmth of the season. A week later, she called. Her voice sounded lighter than I remembered. They'd found a townhouse, 2 bedrooms, small garden closer to her job. It's not the same, she admitted, but it feels right. We'll sign the papers next week. I smiled into the phone. I'm happy for you, Mom. Really? That night, I walked down to the lake and watched the water catch the city lights. The air was cool against my face, and the calm that settled over me wasn't triumph, it was peace. For years, I'd equated love with responsibility, but now I understood it could also mean letting people stand on their own. Through summer, the distance between us slowly became something gentler. We began talking on Sundays, short calls that stayed light at first. Weather work recipes, nothing too heavy. Each week, the silence stretched a little less. By August, my father started joining the calls. His tone was quieter, his words measured but not defensive anymore. Once he even asked about my work, genuinely curious. Your boss must be proud, he said. You've done well for yourself. It was a simple sentence, but it landed like an apology folded inside a compliment. September brought an invitation my parents wanted to visit Chicago just for a weekend. I hesitated, then agreed. I suggested we meet at a restaurant near my apartment, something neutral. When they arrived, I was surprised by how different they looked. My father had lost some weight. The lines in his face seemed deeper, but there was color in his cheeks. My mother wore a soft blue scarf and smiled the way she used to before the years turned heavy. Dinner was cautious at first. We talked about their new place, about my neighborhood, about the changing leaves. When dessert came, my father cleared his throat. I owe you an apology, he said, setting his coffee down. A real one. I looked at him, unsure if I was ready to hear it, but he kept going. Telling you to leave was the worst thing I've ever done, he said. I was angry and ashamed. Losing my job felt like losing who I was. You stepped in when I couldn't, and instead of gratitude, I gave you resentment. I see that now. My mother nodded beside him, tears glinting in her eyes. We leaned on you too much. We made you responsible for our choices. The restaurant felt suddenly still. I took a slow breath, my voice quiet but steady. Thank you for saying that. It means a lot. He nodded, eyes fixed on the table. We're learning, he said softly. It's not easy starting over at our age, but we're figuring it out. After dinner, we walked along the river. The lights reflected on the water like ribbons of gold, and for a while, we didn't talk at all. It wasn't the silence of anger anymore. It was the kind that lets something new begin. They flew home the next morning. When their plane took off, I realized I wasn't waiting for the next crisis. I just wished them well. That was enough. Work continued to thrive. My department hit every target, and Margaret began hinting at another promotion before year's end. I started a modest savings plan, something just for me this time, a down payment fund for a home of my own. The thought didn't fill me with guilt anymore. It filled me with purpose. In October, my parents called again this time from their new townhouse. My mother described how she'd hung curtains herself, how my father had planted marigolds by the front step. She laughed when she said they'd gotten lost trying to find the grocery store, and I found myself laughing with her. The conversations that followed were steady and kind. My father began sending photos of his garden updates. My mother shared new recipes she was proud of. Slowly, we were learning how to love each other without a debt ledger between us. When Thanksgiving arrived, they invited me home, not to the old house, but to their new one. I said yes, and when I stepped through the front door that evening, something felt profoundly different. The air carried the same scent of cinnamon and sage, but the heaviness that used to cling to every corner was gone. Dinner was simple roast turkey green beans, cornbread. No tension, no unspoken expectations. When we finished, my father poured coffee for both of us and motioned for me to join him on the porch. The autumn air was cool and the moon sat low above the trees. I was proud of that old house, he said quietly. It stood for everything I thought made me a man. But losing it showed me something I'd missed. I looked over at him waiting. I thought providing meant control, he continued, that if I couldn't be the provider, I was nothing. But you showed me a different kind of strength. You took care of us when I couldn't, and then you taught us how to take care of ourselves again. The wind rustled through the leaves. For once, I didn't feel the need to fill the silence. I don't expect forgiveness, he said after a moment. But I hope you know I love you, and I'm proud of the woman you've become. I smiled, tears catching in my throat. I know, Dad, and I love you too. We sat there until the cold crept into our sleeves. When I finally stood to go back inside, he reached out and rested a hand over mine. It was the same hand that once pointed me toward the door. This time, it stayed gentle and still. That weekend before flying back to Chicago, I helped my mother plant a few tulip bulbs by the walkway. She told me they'd bloom in spring bright and early. As I pressed the soil around them, I thought about all the years we'd spent avoiding the truth, how sometimes it takes the hardest winters to make anything grow. When the plane lifted off the runway that evening, the city lights of Boston stretched out beneath me like a constellation I no longer belonged to, but could finally appreciate from afar. Back in Chicago, the first snow arrived early, brushing the lake in quiet white lines. I unpacked my coat, made tea, and stood by the window of my apartment, the one that overlooked the skyline. For the first time, I saw not just where I was, but how far I'd come. There was no resentment left, no bitterness. Just a calm sense of closure. The old life had ended, but a better one had begun for all of us. And though I didn't know it yet, the next spring would bring a new beginning of my own one that would remind me that peace, once found, has a way of expanding beyond its borders. The first real warmth of spring arrived like a secret whispered through the city. The lake shimmered under a pale morning sky, and the air outside my window carried the faint scent of rain on concrete. I'd been living in Chicago for almost a year now. The rhythm of the city had settled into me, soft traffic at dawn, the whistle of the commuter train, the way the light climbed slowly across my apartment walls each morning. Peace, I'd learned, didn't arrive all at once. It came in small pieces, a cup of coffee enjoyed without anxiety, a Sunday morning with no missed calls, an evening where silence didn't mean loss. The apartment was quiet when I opened my blinds that morning. The tulip on the windowsill had just bloomed bright red against the gray glass, and I smiled, thinking of my mother's garden. She'd texted a photo the night before her own tulips, smaller, but thriving, lined neatly along the walkway of their townhouse. Beneath it, she'd written, "First blooms. Dad says they remind him of you." I made breakfast, slowly savoring the smell of butter on the pan, the low hiss of eggs as they cooked. The phone rang once, and I recognized the number instantly. Boston. "Good morning, sweetheart," my mother said when I answered. "Just wanted to hear your voice." She sounded different these days, lighter, as if the years of tension had been quietly lifted from her shoulders. I told her about the warm weather, about the way the lake glowed at sunrise. She told me how my father had finally been promoted to assistant manager at the store, and how he'd come home last week, grinning like a boy. "We're doing all right," she said softly. "You were right about a lot of things, Dora. Hard truths, but good ones." I felt a smile tug at my mouth. "I'm glad to hear that, Mom." "Really?" She paused. "You sound happy. Happier than I've ever heard you." "I think I am," I said. And for once, it wasn't something I had to convince myself of. After the call, I sat for a while by the window. The city below was beginning to stir joggers by the park, a street musician warming up his saxophone on the corner, a delivery truck rumbling past. It all felt beautifully ordinary. At work, things had flourished. The department I led had grown twice its size, and Margaret had pulled me aside last month to discuss my next step. A director's role, one that came with more responsibility, but also more trust. When she'd said, "You've become the kind of leader people don't just follow, they believe in," I'd felt something inside me steady like roots finally taking hold. But it wasn't just about work anymore. I'd started hiking on weekends again, the way I used to, before life became an endless loop of obligations. Sometimes Alicia and Mark flew out for a visit, and we'd drive north toward Wisconsin, stopping at diners that smelled like coffee and bacon, laughing over pie like we used to in our 20s. Those trips reminded me that joy didn't need to be dramatic to be real. It could live quietly in friendship, in shared stories, in the comfort of being known. In late April, my parents visited again. They arrived carrying a tin of homemade cookies and a small framed photo, my father's idea, according to my mother. It was the three of us taken last Thanksgiving. We were standing outside their new home, my mother's hand on my arm, my father smiling just enough for it to count. When they left that weekend, my father lingered by the door. "You've built a good life here," he said, looking around my apartment. "We're proud of you." It wasn't the kind of pride that demanded anything in return. It was simple, unguarded human. "I'm proud of you too," I said, and meant it. After they left, I placed the photo on my bookshelf beside the tulip. It fit there perfectly, not as a reminder of what I'd lost, but of what we'd rebuilt. By summer, change found me again. I'd closed on my first home, a modest 2-bedroom condo near the lake, built in the 1920s with creaky floors and tall windows. The day I got the keys, I stood alone in the empty living room as the afternoon light poured in through the glass. The air smelled faintly of dust and new beginnings. Alicia called that evening, her voice bubbling with excitement. "So how does it feel?" "Homeowner strangely calm," I said. "Like I've been walking toward this for years and finally arrived." "You did it the right way," she told me. "No guilt, no strings attached. Just you making choices for yourself." I could hear Mark in the background teasing, "Tell her she owes us dinner in that fancy new place." I laughed, promising just that. When we hung up, I sat on the floor surrounded by unpacked moissons. The quiet of the new space didn't scare me. It wrapped around me like a soft blanket. I thought of the years I'd spent defining myself through obligation, the weight of everyone else's expectations. All of it had led me here to a life that finally felt balanced. A week later, I received a call from my father. His voice carried that mix of pride and humility that had become his new normal. "Your mother wants to fly out and help decorate," he said, laughing softly. "She's been looking at curtain fabrics all morning." I smiled. Tell her she can, as long as she remembers I picked the colors this time. He chuckled, and for a moment, the years of anger and misunderstanding felt far behind us. As summer stretched on, my days filled with quiet joy. Work thrived, friendships deepened, and the simple rituals of my new life watering plants, cooking dinners, walking by the lake, became small acts of gratitude. Each evening, I'd stand on my balcony as the sun dipped low, the city glowing gold and silver in the distance. It wasn't the grand kind of happiness, the one that shouts. It was something steadier contentment with both the scars and the peace that followed. In early autumn, my parents visited once more. They brought a basket of late-blooming marigolds from their garden, bright orange against the cooler air. We spent that weekend planting them in pots on my balcony. My father set down the trowel, wiped his hands, and looked out at the horizon. "You know," he said quietly, "those marigolds are tougher than they look. They survive through heat and cold, keep coming back every year. Reminds me of you." My mother smiled at him, then at me. We all learned something about resilience, didn't we? We stayed outside until the sky deepened to purple. The air was cool, but the kind that makes you breathe deeper, like the world is giving you permission to exhale. After they left, I poured a cup of tea and stood by the balcony, watching the marigolds sway in the breeze. Below, the city moved at its usual rhythm, cars, voices, laughter, but I felt still, anchored. I thought of that night years ago when I'd left their house in tears and how far away that version of me felt now. She had carried everyone's weight until she forgot her own shape. But somewhere along the way, she had learned how to stand tall without carrying it all. Peace, I realized, isn't found in the absence of conflict. It's found in the space you protect once you've survived it. Inside, the apartment glowed softly under lamplight. I picked up the framed photo from the shelf and smiled at it one more time before turning off the light. The room went dim, except for the faint shimmer from the window. Outside, the marigolds held their color even in the dark. If this story touched something in you, tell me where you're listening from down in the comments. And if you've ever learned to find peace after being taken for granted, I hope you'll share that too. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories about quiet strength, second chances, and the kind of healing that feels like home. Because sometimes the truest victory isn't walking away, it's walking forward lighter and finally free.